What happens when an entitled duchess meets her match on daytime television? Today, we're diving into one of the most explosive interviews in recent memory, where Meghan Markle's appearance on The View went completely off the rails. From accusations of racism to heated exchanges about privilege, this interview had everything, and by the end, even Whoopi Goldberg had reached her breaking point. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because this story gets wilder by the minute. The studio lights were blazing as the iconic theme music of The View filled the air. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the center of the table, flanked by her co-hosts Joy Behar, Sarah Haynes, Alyssa Farah Griffin, and Sunny Hostin. The energy was electric, anticipation thick in the air as they prepared to welcome their guest, the Duchess of Sussex herself, Meghan Markle. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle, Whoopi announced with her signature gravitas, though there was already a hint of wariness in her voice that regular viewers would recognize. Meghan walked onto the set wearing a flowing beige ensemble that screamed expensive minimalism, her smile perfectly practiced as she waved to the audience. But even as she took her seat, there was something in her posture that suggested she wasn't here to play nice. "Meghan, welcome to The View," Whoopi began, her tone professional but guarded. "We're so glad to have you here today." "Thank you, Whoopi. Though I have to say, I'm a bit surprised by some of the topics your producers suggested we discuss," Meghan replied, her voice carrying that particular blend of wounded innocence and barely concealed irritation that had become her trademark. Joy Behar, never one to back down from potential drama, jumped right in. "Well, Meghan, there's certainly a lot to talk about. Your departure from royal duties, your interview with Oprah, your various projects. Where would you like to start?" Meghan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I think it's important that we address the elephant in the room first. The way I've been treated by the media, by certain members of my own family, and frankly, by shows like this one, has been nothing short of unconscionable." Sarah Haynes shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Meghan, I think we've always tried to be fair in our coverage of you and Harry." "Fair?" Meghan's voice rose slightly, and the practiced composure began to crack. "Sarah, with all due respect, you've had segments questioning my motives, my authenticity, even my mental health struggles. How is that fair?" Alyssa Farah Griffin, the newest addition to the panel, tried to interject diplomatically. "I think what Sarah means is that we've covered all sides of the story. Journalism requires us to ask tough questions. Tough questions or character assassination." Meghan shot back, her eyes flashing. "Because there's a difference, Alyssa, and I think you know that." Whoopi could sense the tension escalating and tried to steer the conversation back on track. "Meghan, I understand you've faced criticism, but surely you also understand that public figures, especially those in your position, are going to face scrutiny." "Scrutiny, yes. Racist attacks and deliberate misrepresentation, no," Meghan replied firmly. "And Whoopi, I'm surprised that you, of all people, would dismiss the racial component of what I've experienced." The audience grew quiet, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Whoopi's expression hardened slightly, a warning sign that anyone who knew her would recognize. "I'm not dismissing anything, Meghan, but I also think it's important to be precise about these accusations," Whoopi said carefully. "Precise?" Meghan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The precision is in the pattern, Whoopi. Every successful woman of color who speaks her truth faces this same playbook. Question her motives, attack her character, make her the villain." In her own story, Sunny Hostin, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "Meghan, as a woman of color myself, I understand the challenges you're referring to. But don't you think some of the criticism might be valid? The way you've handled certain situations, the timing of certain revelations." Meghan turned to Sunny with an expression of betrayal. "Sunny, I expected better from you. The fact that you're sitting here questioning my truth, my lived experience, is exactly the problem. You should be supporting me, not tearing me down." "I'm not tearing you down," Sunny replied evenly. "I'm asking legitimate questions about your choices and their consequences." "My choices?" Meghan's voice was getting louder now, her carefully constructed public persona beginning to unravel. "My choice to marry the man I love. My choice to start a family. My choice to speak out against racism and institutional gaslighting." Joy Behar, sensing an opening, pressed forward. "Meghan, Nobody's questioning your right to marry Harry or start a family. But some of your other choices, like the timing of your Oprah interview, the way you've handled family relationships, these are fair topics for discussion. Fair according to whom? Meghan demanded. According to a media establishment that profits from my pain? According to people who have never walked in my shoes, never faced what I've faced. Whoopi's patience was beginning to wear thin. Meghan, with respect, you've had a platform that most people can only dream of. You've been able to tell your story to millions of people. That's not being silenced. Having a platform and being heard are two different things, Whoopi, Meghan replied coldly. And frankly, I'm disappointed that this show, which claims to support women, is falling into the same tired patterns of victim blaming and gaslighting. The tension in the studio was now palpable. Camera operators were adjusting their angles. Producers were frantically communicating through earpieces, and the audience sat in stunned silence. Alyssa tried once more to defuse the situation. I think we all want to understand your perspective, Meghan, but surely you can see how some of your actions might have been perceived differently by different people. Perceived differently by people who refuse to acknowledge their own biases, Meghan snapped. Alyssa, you worked in the Trump administration. You should understand what it's like to have your every move scrutinized and misrepresented. That's exactly why I'm trying to have a nuanced conversation, Alyssa replied, her own composure beginning to crack. But you seem determined to paint anyone who asks you a challenging question as racist or malicious. Meghan's eyes narrowed. And you seem determined to minimize the very real discrimination I've faced. The microaggressions, the coded language, the double standards. It's all there if you're willing to see it. Sarah Haynes, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, attempted to lighten the mood. Meghan, let's talk about something more positive. Your charitable work, your new projects. What's bringing you joy these days? But Meghan wasn't interested in changing the subject. You know what would bring me joy, Sarah? Accountability. Acknowledgement. The admission that I've been treated unfairly by institutions that claim to value diversity and inclusion but practice something entirely different. Whoopi had heard enough. Meghan, I think you're asking for something that might not be realistic. The world isn't going to apologize to you for every criticism or challenging question. I'm not asking the world to apologize, Meghan replied, her voice rising to a near shout. I'm asking for basic human decency and recognition of the truth. But apparently, that's too much to ask from this panel. The silence that followed Meghan's outburst was deafening. You could practically hear the collective intake of breath from the studio audience as they realized they were witnessing television history in the making. Whoopi's expression had shifted from professional courtesy to something much more serious. Her famous eyebrows knitted together in a way that spelled trouble. Excuse me, Whoopi said slowly, her voice dropping to that dangerous low register that regular viewers knew meant business. Did you just suggest that this panel lacks basic human decency? Meghan seemed to realize she had crossed a line, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. I'm suggesting that the questions you're asking, the way you're framing this conversation, shows a fundamental lack of understanding about what I've endured. What you've endured. Joy Behar's voice cracked with incredulity. Meghan, you married a prince. You lived in palaces. You had the world's attention. Many people would consider that pretty fortunate. Fortunate. Meghan's laugh was bitter and sharp. Joy, would you consider it fortunate to have your mental health destroyed? To have your family turn against you? To have your own father sell stories about you to tabloids? But those are personal family issues, Sarah interjected gently. Every family has problems. The difference is yours played out on a global stage because of the choices you and Harry made. Meghan whipped around to face Sarah, her composure completely gone now. Choices we made. Sarah, we didn't choose to be hounded by paparazzi. We didn't choose to have racist articles written about us. We didn't choose to have our privacy invaded at every turn. But you did choose to give that interview with Oprah, Sunny pointed out calmly. You chose to make very serious allegations about the royal family on international television. Because we had no other choice. Meghan exploded. We try to handle things quietly, privately, through proper channels. But when you're dealing with an institution that prioritizes its image over the safety and well-being of its members, sometimes you have to speak your truth publicly. Alyssa leaned forward, her political training evident in her measured response. Meghan, I understand the frustration of feeling unheard within an institution. But surely you can see how some people might view that interview as one-sided, as not giving the other parties a chance to respond. One-sided. Meghan's voice rose to a pitch that made several audience members wince. Alyssa, the other side has had centuries to tell their story. They have an entire media machine working for them. When exactly would have been the right time for me to speak my truth? Whoopi had been watching this exchange with growing irritation, her fingers drumming on the table in a rhythm that anyone who knew her would recognize as a warning sign. Meghan, I think the issue here is that you seem to believe that your truth is the only truth that matters. No, Whoopi, the issue is that you seem to believe that there are two sides to racism. Meghan shot back, her voice dripping with condescension. There aren't. Either something is racist or it isn't. Either an institution supports its diverse members or it doesn't. The studio fell silent again, but this time the energy was electric with tension. Whoopi's eyes narrowed, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades in the entertainment industry and countless battles fought and won. Young lady, you need to check yourself right now, Whoopi said, each word deliberate and measured. You do not get to come onto my show and lecture me about racism. You do not get to sit at this table and act like you invented struggle. Meghan's face flushed, but she pressed on. I'm not saying I invented struggle, but I am saying that my struggle is valid and deserves to be acknowledged without being constantly questioned and diminished. Nobody is diminishing your struggle, Joy interjected, her own patience clearly worn thin. But you can't expect to be immune from all criticism just because you've faced challenges. I don't expect to be immune from criticism, Meghan replied through gritted teeth. I expect criticism to be fair and based in reality, not racist stereotypes and deliberate mischaracterizations. Sarah tried once more to find middle ground. Meghan, I think we all agree that you've faced unfair treatment in some areas. But don't you think it's possible that some of the criticism you've received might be legitimate concerns about your approach to certain situations? My approach. Meghan's voice was now openly hostile. Sarah, what exactly is wrong with my approach? Speaking honestly about my experiences? Protecting my family? Refusing to be silenced by an institution that clearly didn't value me? Nobody's asking you to be silenced, Sunny said firmly. But maybe consider that the way you've chosen to speak out has consequences, and some of those consequences might be self-inflicted. Meghan turned on Sunny with fury in her eyes. Self-inflicted? Sunny, I cannot believe you just said that. You, as a woman of color, are sitting here telling me that the racism I've experienced is self-inflicted? That's not what I said, Sunny replied calmly, though her own irritation was starting to show. I said that some of the consequences of how you've chosen to handle certain situations might be self-inflicted. There's a difference. No, there isn't, Meghan snapped. You're victim-blaming, plain and simple. And frankly, it's disgusting. Coming from someone who should understand exactly what I'm talking about. Alyssa couldn't contain herself any longer. Meghan, you can't just throw around accusations of racism and victim-blaming every time someone disagrees with you or asks you a tough question. I'm not throwing around anything, Meghan replied coldly. I'm calling out what I see. And what I see is a panel of women who claim to support other women but are perfectly willing to tear down a woman of color who dares to speak her truth. Whoopi's hands slammed down on the table, the sound echoing through the studio like a gunshot. That's enough, she said, her voice cutting through Meghan's tirade like a knife. You do not get to come onto this show and tell us who we are or what we stand for. But Meghan wasn't backing down. I'm not telling you who you are, Whoopi. I'm telling you what you're doing. And what you're doing is perpetuating the same harmful narratives that have been used against women like me for generations. Women like you. Whoopi's voice was dangerous now, barely controlled fury simmering beneath the surface. What exactly do you mean by women like you? Meghan seemed to realize she was treading on thin ice, but her pride wouldn't let her retreat. I mean women of color who dare to speak truth to power. Women who refuse to be grateful for scraps. Women who demand better and get punished for it. The audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The other panelists exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with how far this had escalated, but none of them willing to interrupt what was clearly building to an explosive climax. Joy tried one last time to inject some reason into the conversation. Meghan, I think we've gotten off track here. Nobody is trying to punish you for speaking your truth. We're just trying to have a balanced conversation about complex issues. Balanced? Meghan laughed bitterly. Joy, there's nothing balanced about this conversation. It's been an attack from the moment I sat down, disguised as journalism, but really just character assassination with a smile. That was apparently the final straw for Whoopi, whose legendary composure finally cracked completely. Whoopi stood up slowly from her chair, her imposing presence filling the studio as every eye turned to her. The legendary host's face was a mask of controlled fury, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades fighting real battles and earning every ounce of respect she commanded. "Let me tell you something, Duchess," Whoopi began, emphasizing the title with unmistakable sarcasm. "I have been in this business longer than you've been alive. I have faced real racism, real discrimination, real struggles that you couldn't even imagine in your worst nightmares." Meghan opened her mouth to respond, but Whoopi held up a hand that brooked no argument. "I'm not finished," Whoopi continued, her voice rising with each word. "You want to talk about women of color speaking truth to power? I was doing that when you were still figuring out which fork to use at fancy dinners. So don't you dare sit at my table and lecture me about what it means to be a black woman in America." The studio was so quiet you could hear the camera motors adjusting focus. Meghan's face had gone pale, but her jaw was set in stubborn defiance. "Whoopi, you don't know what I've been through," Meghan said, her voice shaking slightly but still defiant. "You don't know the specific challenges I've faced as a biracial woman entering that particular institution." "You're right. I don't know about entering palaces and marrying princes," Whoopi shot back. "What I do know is working 3 jobs to feed my family. What I do know is being told I wasn't pretty enough, smart enough, or white enough for Hollywood. What I do know is earning my place through talent and perseverance, not through marriage." The attack hit home, and Meghan's composure finally shattered completely. "How dare you diminish my achievements by suggesting I only got where I am through marriage? I was a successful actress before I ever met Harry." Joy couldn't help herself. "Successful is a relative term, Meghan. Let's be honest about your career trajectory before the royal connection." "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Meghan said, her voice now shrill with desperation. "You can't just let me exist without tearing me down. Every accomplishment has to be questioned. Every struggle has to be minimized." Sunny shook her head in disbelief. "Meghan, nobody is tearing you down. We're having a conversation about your public statements and actions. That's what happens when you put yourself in the public eye." "A conversation?" Meghan laughed bitterly. "This isn't a conversation, it's a pile-on. It's 5 women ganging up on one because you can't handle the truth I'm telling." Alyssa finally lost her diplomatic cool. "The truth you're telling? Meghan, you've spent this entire interview attacking our integrity, questioning our motives, and accusing us of racism because we dared to ask you legitimate questions." "They weren't legitimate questions," Meghan snapped. "They were gotcha questions designed to make me look bad. This whole interview was a setup from the beginning." Sarah, who had been trying to maintain peace throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up with evident frustration. "Meghan, we asked you about your public statements, your choices, and your experiences. How is that a setup?" "Because you refuse to acknowledge the context," Meghan replied, her voice cracking with emotion. "You refuse to acknowledge the racism, the institutional bias, the way I've been systematically undermined and attacked." Whoopi had heard enough. She walked around the table toward Meghan's chair, her presence commanding and intimidating. "You know what your problem is?" Whoopi said, pointing directly at Meghan. "You think being a victim gives you a license to be awful to everyone around you. You think your pain justifies attacking anyone who doesn't immediately validate every single thing you say." "I'm not attacking anyone," Meghan protested, but her voice lacked conviction now. "Really?" Whoopi's eyebrows shot up. "You've called us racist, accused us of victim blaming, suggested we lack basic human decency, and questioned our integrity as journalists and women. What would you call that?" Meghan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, clearly struggling to find a response that didn't make her look worse. "I was defending myself," she finally managed weakly. "No," Joy interjected firmly. "Defending yourself would be explaining your position, providing context, or correcting misunderstandings. What you did was attack us personally because you didn't like the questions." The questions were unfair, Meghan insisted, but even she seemed to realize how petulant she sounded. The questions were standard, Sunny said coolly. Any public figure should expect to be asked about their public statements and actions. The fact that you can't handle basic accountability says more about you than it does about us. Whoopi returned to her position at the head of the table, but remained standing, her body language making it clear that this interview was nearing its end. Meghan, I've given you every opportunity to have a real conversation today, Whoopi said, her voice now deadly calm. Instead, you've chosen to attack this show, attack this panel, and frankly, make a fool of yourself on national television. I'm making a fool of myself. Meghan's voice rose again. I'm the one trying to have an honest conversation about important issues while you all gang up on me. Honest conversation? Alyssa laughed incredulously. Meghan, you haven't answered a single direct question. Every time we ask you something substantive, you deflect and attack us instead. Because your questions are designed to trap me, Meghan shot back. The only trap here is the one you've set for yourself, Whoopi said with finality. And I think it's time for this interview to end. Meghan's eyes widened in shock. You're ending the interview? I am, Whoopi confirmed, her voice brooking no argument. This isn't an interview anymore. It's a therapy session, and we're not qualified therapists. You can't just kick me off, Meghan protested, desperation creeping into her voice. Actually, I can, Whoopi replied matter-of-factly. It's my show, my set, and my decision. And my decision is that this conversation has run its course. Meghan looked around the table at the other panelists, clearly hoping for support, but found only stony faces and crossed arms. The reality of what had just happened seemed to finally sink in. This is outrageous, she said, standing up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is exactly the kind of silencing and bullying I was